Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards. Applications and nominations are open now. The Diller Teen Tikkun Olam Awards honor up to 15 Jewish teens from across the United States with an award of $36,000 to recognize their impact and leadership to repair the world. Nominate a teen leader today, or they can apply directly by January 5th. Learn more at dillerteenawards.org.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 399. God? Gods? Godesses? Godexes? Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we're excited to offer another episode this week, which is kind of a sneak preview of one of our Yeshiva classes. Now, it's also, of course, interesting in its own right. That's why this is one of the Yeshiva classes. So we're excited to be having this conversation today with our guest, Tamar Kamionkowski, and also excited to be able to tell you that if you like what you hear, you can hear a lot more of it by signing up for Tamar Kamionkowski's class at the Yeshiva. It's got the same title as today's episode, which is God, Gods, Goddesses, Godexes. And you can register for this class and any of the classes at judaismunbound.com/classes. In fact, even if you miss the first week of a class, you can still sign up because you will receive a link to the video of the first class, and you can just catch right up before you come to the second class. So again, head to judaismunbound.com/classes where you can investigate all your options. And I also want to note that we are also very committed to the Yeshiva being accessible to everyone, regardless of whether you're able to afford the sticker price of those classes. So there is a sliding scale for every class. And also, if you need financial aid beyond that, there is an easy to fill out form requesting that. Now, here's a brief description of Tamar Kamionkowski's class, which is also a brief description of the topic of today's episode. She writes, many mainstream Jewish traditions present a clear demarcation between the world of humanity and nature on the one hand, and God on the other. In this course, we will explore how divine presence was understood in ancient Israel and how it was expressed in biblical literature. Tanakh, that's Hebrew Bible, reveals more malleable boundaries between the divine and human dimensions of the world. Its texts present a variety of ideas regarding the nature of God, gods, and human beings. The authors of the Tanakh recognized more than the national God of Israel. They had a variety of opinions regarding the role of other gods in the life of the people Israel. The role of the dead, divine messengers, and superhuman people. Topics of study in the class will include, how did Yahweh become the God of Israel? Did the Israelites have a goddess? Are there demons and angels in the Hebrew Bible? Was there ancestor worship? How does the God of Israel manifest gender? Does God have a body in biblical literature? Where did God live? What kinds of representations of God were permissible? Why monotheism? And if that doesn't entice you to pause this episode right now and head to judaismunbound.com/classes to sign up for the class, we hope that listening to the rest of the episode will do just that. So a few words of introduction. In addition to being a teacher in the Yeshiva, Tamar Kamionkowski is a distinguished biblical scholar and educator who has been on the faculty of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College since 1997. In the past, she served as vice president for academic affairs and dean at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. In her work at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Tamar Kamionkowski emphasized rabbinic identity and character development in rabbinical education. Her book, Leviticus, A Women's Commentary, was the first feminist and post-colonial commentary on Leviticus. She is also the author of Gender Reversal and Cosmic Chaos and co-editor of Bodies, Embodiment, and Theology of the Hebrew Scriptures. Tamar Kamionkowski is the founder of the Kamionkowski Beit Midrash, an online center for Hebrew learning. And with expertise in various languages, she has contributed to various esteemed institutions and served in leadership roles for biblical and religious societies. Tamar Kamionkowski holds a Master of Theological Studies degree from Harvard Divinity School and a PhD in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University. So, Tamar Kamionkowski, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, we just came through the high holiday season, and I think a lot of people's experience when they go to services, or perhaps when they choose not to go to services, is that they don't believe in God, or the God that's being talked about isn't the God that they believe in. And I think that they imagine that there is a particular God who we find in the Bible that they may or may not believe in. And it's a lot more complex than that. So I'm wondering, just as a place to start, can you talk a little bit about how you think your average layperson should be thinking about the question of who is God in the Bible?
Yeah, sure. So I can tell you that as we just passed the holidays, especially on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we talk about God a lot as a king, right? There are a lot of king, or in Hebrew, melech, references. So it is no surprise that people who go to services will then start imagining God as king. And then that usually comes with, the old man with the long beard, who's up in the heavens judging us for what we do. But the truth is that God has meant something different to every generation of Jews. And the idea of expressing different opinions about what and who God is a tradition that goes all the way back to the biblical period. There is no God of the Hebrew Bible. That is one of the greatest misconceptions about the Bible, both for Jews and for Christians. If you look at the variety of biblical texts, you will see that there are many different opinions that are being offered about the nature of God, where God lives, does God have a body? There's no question that within the biblical text, God is always supernatural. God is a divine being who is essentially different from human beings. But the nature of that difference is really different from text to text. Even in antiquity, there were conversations about the nature of God rather than attempts to state this is the truth. Part of what makes the text so fascinating is that they allow room and they allow voices for many different God ideas.
When we see multiple ideas about God in the Bible, are we generally looking at certain times in the biblical period, there were debates about what God was or what God might mean? Or are we really looking at more like an archaeological tell where we're seeing different layers of an evolution of what God meant? And there was at any given point in time a majority view of the Jews or the Israelites as to who God might be, or there never has been something like that?
So the archaeological record definitely shows us development in God ideas over time. Within the biblical texts, my sense is that while many historians try to present an evolutionary model of God development from a primitive God idea to a more kind of ethical monotheistic God, I don't think that trying to look at this from an historical perspective is the most useful. Instead, I think that there were different opinions at different times, so there can be multiple senses of what God is and who God is to ancient Israel side by side. If you ask those associated with the palace and the kings, they're going to have a certain kind of theology, which is going to differ from the guys who are right down the street, the Kohanim, the priests in the temple, who have their own vision and understanding of what God is. So the historical context or approach is really not helpful. Instead, I think it is a lot more useful to think about coexisting communities and the different kinds of theologies that they had based on their situation in life.
So I want to dwell in the title of your class because it's 4 words and then a subtitle. But the 4 words definitely are enough to talk about for a whole podcast episode and probably 100. It's God, ? Gods, ? Goddesses, ? Godexes, ? My hope is that we can sort of get to each of these in different angles and they can blur together too. But I kind of want to start, we've touched a little on God ? There's different notions of God in biblical text. Gods ? Plural. For some people that might feel like, oh there, what is this? Some kind of heresy podcast? Answer, yes. But also, maybe that's right there in front of us in the biblical text. I'm curious to talk about that God's plural question. People I was taught in high school, at a secular high school, that Judaism boils down to, quote, ethical monotheism. That's its essence. And it's been like that since the Torah, and it has flowed from there till now. I don't think that's right. And I think that the Bible itself, play around with scholars and you get all sorts of fun terms. You get things like henotheism and monolatry. And then, for me, forgetting all those fancy terms, I look at the word for God, and one of the big ones is Elohim, which is a plural word. It could be translated as God, but it can also be translated as gods. And so I'm curious to open up that kettle of fish. What does it mean for there potentially to be more than one God, not just in the sense that there's different visions of God, but that like there's more than one God?
Thank you for that question. So I think we need to begin this conversation by recognizing that Judaism is not a Hebrew Bible or Old Testament religion. Judaism and Christianity were actually born around the same time. So what we call Judaism today comes from rabbinic Judaism, rabbinic interpretations of the text to try to make meaning out of chaos, right, after the destruction of the temple. So the notion of monotheism or ethical monotheism is really rooted in the rabbis and other scholars who followed in the generations after the rabbis, reading back onto the texts because of the beliefs that they then had during the Second Temple period. Within the Bible itself, the practices and beliefs that are recorded are those of the ancient Israelites. And while our narratives create a connection for us with those ancestors, our practices are really not biblical practices. So the reason that we talk about gods with the question mark is because there are few, truly, if any, statements that there is only the God of Israel. For example, the line that says, Mi kamocha ba'elim Adonai, which in English is, who is like you among the gods, is really a praise of the God of Israel, written out in Hebrew as Yud He Vav He, and often then referred to as Adonai. It's the claim that Adonai is the best of them all. So there seems to be a recognition that there were always a variety of gods, that there was a pantheon of gods, and that what the Israelites felt so proud about was that their God was number one, was the best God. There are a few Psalms that talk about a divine assembly and actually narrate the ascension of the God of Israel as the primary God because the other gods did not rule with justice. So again, one of the unique features of the Israelite God was that this God was rooted and committed and demanded justice as part of human life and interaction. They're not saying that the other gods don't exist. They're just saying that their God of justice is the best God. So if we look at the national level, once Israel became a kingdom under King David and Solomon, we know then that this God of Israel, Yud He Vav He, became the national God. This was the God who was associated with the kingdom. So if you were a citizen or a subject of the kingdom of Israel and Judah, when they were united, then you would swear your allegiance to this God of Israel. The Queen Jezebel is often described as one of the most evil, pagan-oriented queens in ancient Israel. The Bible claims that she worshipped other gods and therefore she was evil and had turned away from her loyalty to the God of Israel. Well, what she was probably doing was opening trade relationships with the nations that were around Israel. And as we know, when you establish international relationships, you need a place for the merchants and the politicians when they're visiting your country. They need their own embassy. They need a place where they can worship their own God. If the ancient Israelite kingdom had a relationship with the neighboring Moabites, and they had a great trade relationship, which was good for everyone, well, then those visiting Moabites needed a place to pray. And the biblical perception is that she is worshiping and actually worshiping these other gods instead of the God of Israel.
I wanted to go back to what you were saying about we're thinking about the origins of Judaism a little bit the wrong way, that the Judaism that we inhabit, like you say, is the Judaism that was really created by the rabbis after the destruction of the Second Temple. And I imagine that what you're describing is almost a kind of founder's effect, that there was probably one of the versions of God that was around at that time was this kind of king version. And the rabbis took that one on, and that became the single God of rabbinic Judaism. And I'm wondering, once we see it that way, what is the forward-looking value of looking backwards into the Bible and saying, hey, look at all these other gods and goddesses and godexes and all these possibilities, because those are the gods of the proto-Judaism. And I have a sense that there is real value to that, and that people are accessing those ideas now, today, practically. I'm talking in practical terms as opposed to academic terms. People are accessing those and are doing some really creative work. I guess I'm mostly curious about your thoughts in terms of what is that process about? How do we think about these ancient gods, even though we inhabited Judaism that kind of left them behind for 1,500 years or so? But I'm also kind of wondering whether, in the same way that you're saying that Judaism and Christianity, in a sense, come from a common ancestor, which the Jews like to claim is Judaism, but actually it was something else, that maybe some of us who are doing some of this work today and reimagining Judaism are actually imagining a new religion or a new post-Judaism that will one day look at the Judaism of the rabbis as a common ancestor?
Well, I can tell you when I was a student at Harvard Divinity School about 35 years ago, I took a course on goddesses and gods, and I was curious about what it would feel like to bring a sense of the goddess, of female aspects of God that we find traces of within the Bible, to bring that into actual Jewish practice. And so for a few years, I actually baked challah every week on Fridays in the shape of a buxom woman. I actually did this when I was living in Jerusalem. And one day I brought this buxom challah over to my grandmother's house, and I set it on the table, and I was thinking, how do I explain this to her so she doesn't freak out? What am I going to say? Because I really want her to see this and think about this. And she didn't say a word. Instead, she put the two candlesticks for Shabbat on each side of the challah and looked at me and smiled. And that was the extent of the conversation. Here's my current thinking on all of this. To jump right back straight into biblical texts and to ignore all of the centuries of Jewish interpretation is really what the Karaites did, where they wanted to go just straight back to Bible and make that the basis of worship. We can't ignore everything that's happened in all of the many, many years, because over the centuries, Judaism has become associated with monotheism. I think the value in looking at the complexity and variety of biblical theologies is in helping us to get a more nuanced sense of the divine world. So there are some beautiful aspects to monotheism, and there are also some pretty challenging ones about hegemony and only allowing one way of doing things. So I think it's possible to still imagine a monotheism, but a monotheism which is nuanced. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, the national god of Babylonia and then of Assyria was seen as the central god, but then all of the other gods of the pantheon were almost like aspects or emanations of that god. And actually, within Judaism, Kabbalah, Jewish mystical practices, adopted this idea of many different emanations of God, that God expresses God's self in a variety of ways, and that each of those is a quality in and of itself. So I like to think that exploring the different ideas of divinity within the Bible allows us to develop a more complex idea of God rather than just simplifying to one image or picture that everyone has.
So I really appreciate what you're bringing up around how the Judaism that we've inherited, most of us, and just shouts to Sean Leisha, who is a Karaite and who we've had on the show and who reminded us that not all folks today are heirs only to the rabbinic tradition. But the Judaism that most of us have inherited is a rabbinic Judaism. I think for me, I've reached a point today, it's funny, like I'm ordained as a rabbi, which I think would lead somebody to think, oh, that person is a rabbinic Jew. They're a rabbi. I don't actually know if I'm a rabbinic Jew or if I am a Jew who takes a lot of rabbinic tradition very seriously, but also is really devoted to other Judaisms that are not just rabbinic. And I think that comes up in these conversations because for me, I actually do, like, I don't want to just see the Bible, and I'm not saying you necessarily said this, but I don't want to just see it as like prehistory. I don't want to just see it as these were competing visions of God or gods or goddesses that were around, past tense. And then like we sort of reached a point where it's not that they became one. There's still, even in rabbinic Judaism, different notions of God. And I think you could even argue gods, plural, even within rabbinic Judaism later, that would be somebody else's class to teach one day in the Onion Yeshiva. But I really want to create a Jewish world where basically we see Jewish theology as something that is not a closed conversation. Like, I think people presume there are Jewish names of God, and you could look through a bunch of books, most of them older, and find all the notions of God, and that's the Jewish ideas of God. But from my perspective, we today have as much agency in that as every generation before. And so I'm kind of called not only to look into the rabbinic text, but to look to those biblical texts, not only with rabbinic goggles on, but as themselves and say, oh, so maybe rabbis did do a certain set of things with this idea. Maybe they erased this thing that we might read as a goddess. Maybe they changed this plural to be singular. Like, do I want to do that or do I want to do a different thing? And I've also kind of become like, I think there was a stage in my life where I was a rabbinic Jew, a rabbinic Reform Jew, but like growing up as a rabbinic Jew. I actually did have a phase of my life where I thought of myself partially as Karaite. So I was really interested in Bible specifically. And then I think the last few years, I have been thinking of myself as an apocryphal Jew. And what I mean by that is there's books called Apocrypha that didn't make the biblical canon. And I like those books, but it's less about those books. It's more about the act of seeking out Jewish stories, Jewish theologies that have been sidelined and claiming them as Jewish. I think some of the people that are called to your class, because I've spoken with some of them, they're excited about this kind of detective work. Like, I feel like a lot of us, we feel as if we were taught limited notions of what God is. I don't want to make it sound like everybody in Jewish spaces is saying there's only one vision. But like, no, there's many. There's different names. We hear them, and people don't just say it's king and beard in the sky, but like, we get a few. We go into the Bible and like, oh, there's an Asherah tree that people seem to be relating to as divine. There's the plural that I talked about. Like, How might we be advised in that effort? And I recognize you're a scholar. You're a scholar and you're a teacher in Jewish spaces. You bring both of those lenses. For people who are called to this class because they're really energized, not just by the history of it, not just, oh, this was a set of theologies that existed and now we have rabbinic ones, but actually as sort of those theologies being alive and possibly affecting their practice.
When we're in conversation, we use these big terms. We talk about the Hebrew Bible. We talk about rabbinic Judaism as if these were whole entities without any variety. But the reality of Jewish life has always been a variety of practices and beliefs going on simultaneously. A period in Jewish history might have some men studying Talmud in a yeshiva, while the Kabbalists are having banquets and imagining actual connections with God and all of God's emanations. And those are two radically different views of God and different practices. And each thought that the other was ridiculous. And then all of the practices that were not written down, right? Rabbinic Judaism, Hebrew Bible, we're talking about written texts. And we know that texts are generally written and preserved by those who have the power. So what were women doing in the household? What were their ideas about God? What kinds of practices and rituals did they engage in? I don't think there ever really has been a rabbinic Judaism. I think we talk about rabbinic Judaism and we do ourselves a disservice. One example that comes to mind from the biblical period is in the book of Jeremiah. A group of women are being chastised by Jeremiah for worshiping other gods. And their response is, hey, when we used to make cakes for Malkat Hashemayim, for the Queen of Heaven, we weren't being invaded by other nations. We didn't have famine. Life was actually pretty good. And then you came along and you want us to do your thing. Well, that's your thing and not ours. And they continue to say, and look, it's not just us, the women. Who do you think is cutting down and bringing all of the wood for the fires? It's our husbands, it's our children. So if we could imagine ourselves as inheritors of that community, and we can call them forebears of Judaism as much as the words of Jeremiah, then we have a fascinating practice of baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven. And I can't but help thinking that even to this day, when we have the process of baking challah and taking a little snippet of the challah and throwing it into the oven, that is actually a remnant of the ancient practice of offering some of the bread to the Queen of Heaven. So I think it's really about which kinds of practices we raise up as normative. And part of the issue here is that we are accepting normative Judaism and then trying to go against it. But in truth, there have always been options. There have always been a variety of practices. Earth-based Judaism, Judaism that has echoes of the tree worship, the importance of trees, that all of these are part of our tradition. They've just been set aside by those who have the most authority.
Once we start reaching back for that breaking bread for the Queen of Heaven and adding those practices to what we've inherited from the rabbis who are men, whether we are creating a version of rabbinic Judaism that now has some of those elements in it, or are we actually creating a new version of Judaism? And perhaps that new version of Judaism is actually something that we can call Judaism, but maybe in 1,000 years from now, when they look back at it, they will be recognizing that as the early days of this new thing that was the daughter of Judaism, that would have seen Judaism as a common ancestor. And on this podcast, we've talked a fair bit about God, but we haven't talked that much about Ezekiel. And I know that that's a subject dear to your heart. And I'm thinking about Ezekiel, who is one of the early generation after the destruction of the first temple. And so where we think about the rabbis as being the ones who built a new Judaism after the destruction of the second temple, who were those people after the destruction of the first temple who lived in the Babylonian exile for a while, and then some of their descendants came back to the land of Israel? And we think of that as part of the, quote, biblical period. But the reality is that that itself was probably best understood as another new version of Judaism. And I'm curious about what you can tell us about that version of Judaism and how it differed from what had come before. And I think that just even inviting people to read the book of Ezekiel out of this conversation, I mean, maybe that could be your next class at the Onion Yeshiva, because partly because of some of the ideas, but partly just because I think he's an incredible artist. I think he's like the Steven Spielberg of the Babylonian exile. His writing is at a level beyond the other writing. It's so, the images are so evocative and so detailed. It almost feels like you're watching a movie. So that's a big question about both giving you a chance to talk about Ezekiel, but also our future. So I'm hoping you can put those two pieces together.
Sure. So one of the things that I think Ezekiel and the rabbis shared is that they were both trying to build something new out of a tragedy and loss. And this really brings us to a larger conversation for another time about the role of trauma in establishing our practices. One of the things that actually excites me about a lot of what's happening in Judaism today is that we are not trying to remake Judaism because we just experienced some kind of trauma and the old ways didn't work. And now we have to think, what did we do wrong? And then create a new system to ensure, right, in this fantasy that everything will be okay in the future. The ways that people are thinking about Judaism now is really coming from a place of abundance and of possibility and thinking, what can we make this into, rather than how are we going to survive? And I know that when I was a kid going to school in a Hebrew school and conservative synagogue, we learned about the Holocaust. It was always Holocaust, Holocaust. We were in elementary school and they were showing us films of the concentration camps. And it was all about survival. And we had to be Jews because we owed it to all of those others who had been persecuted and killed. Nowadays, there is a sense of wanting to engage in Judaism because it can be meaningful, it can be spiritually enlightening, it can connect people together. So as we look to the biblical worlds and to other resources as well, I'm hoping that developing a sense of where Judaism goes from a place of abundance and love will really open the door to allowing some of these ancient traditions to come into our lives now, rather than feeling like everything has to be kept so tightly and so strictly.
So let's live in Ezekiel a little more. I don't usually read excerpts of guests' work, but I feel called to, both because I think it relates to some of the things we're talking about, with Dan saying, oh, there's so much imagery in the book of Ezekiel. But also because I think this will be good registration bait, clickbait for registration for your class. You wrote an article a number of years ago in Zeke magazine, which Zeke based on Ezekiel. So fun little connection. That's not all their articles were about Ezekiel, but this one, you say at the beginning of the article, it was 1999 and I was a visiting scholar at a synagogue in Florida teaching a workshop on Ezekiel. Midstream, I found myself saying words I had not anticipated saying to these suburban mainstream Jews. Ezekiel 16, verse 17, is referring to a strap-on dildo, and Ezekiel is referencing the emasculation of God by the collective body of Israel, who is assuming the phallic penetrative role in the divine-human relationship. Gulp. You wrote the gulp. That's not me saying gulp. So I'll close the excerpt there. Pretty great opening to an article. But it opens up, so it continues on the Ezekiel thread we were on. And so more on Ezekiel if you got it. But it also opens up some stuff related to the third and fourth questions in your title. Godesses, Godexes. This, we're talking about dildos and penetrative roles in relationship. Like, this brings up questions of sexuality and of gender. And so I'd love to open that up a little bit. I mean, what can we learn, whether it's Ezekiel or anywhere else, from the different ways in which the Hebrew Bible refers to God's gender, or the different windows it gives in? What can we learn when we look at the lens of gender and God in the Bible?
Yeah, well, Ezekiel is a really interesting, and I would say an extreme case. So Ezekiel lived during a time of immense upheaval, cognitive dissonance, everything that he and his community believed, the foundations of their world just fell apart. And so for Ezekiel, he felt that something must have happened within the community that would lead to such an enormous catastrophe. And he believed that God controlled everything, right? This one very masculine God of Israel controlled everything. So in his imagination, he was a very dualistic thinker. You were either male or female. Things were either pure or impure, holy or profane and not holy, right? So how could this powerful male God end up losing his land and losing his primary center of worship, and believed that he and his male community were being punished for something? What were they being punished for? Well, they were feeling emasculated in Babylonia. They lost their land, they lost their property, they lost control over things. And in Babylonian culture, women did have a lot more freedom and a lot more opportunities. So Ezekiel's theology was very much informed by his own personal experiences and the experiences of his community and this crisis of identity. We can then compare that with a prophet who came a generation later, also within the Babylonian community, but really as the conditions of the Jews improved in Babylonia and as there were openings to return back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And in that kind of environment, we have a prophet known as Second Isaiah, the part of Isaiah that is covered from chapter 40 through 66 seems to represent another generation, one of Isaiah's followers. This writer, this anonymous writer, was writing during a time of a lot of opportunity, a lot of kind of positive, optimistic conditions. And for him, he actually brings a lot of feminine imagery into his understanding of God. And so as the people are being kind of reborn, getting a new life, he actually describes God as a midwife bringing her children. And this kind of imagery is really throughout those late chapters in the book of Isaiah. And so he developed a more nurturing, loving kind of God. Now that God is still considered a male God, and all of the Hebrew is male, but the imagery is a lot more evocative of more comfort with gender fluidity. Another nice piece is in Isaiah, we have several examples of God being addressed by this prophet and by the community of this prophet, where the words are actually grammatically feminine in the Hebrew. So if you're reading the Hebrew, it sounds like God is being addressed in the feminine, because God's arm is being called to protect the people, and the Hebrew word for arm is feminine. And so for someone who's comfortable with the Hebrew, they would be reading about a God who's being addressed in the feminine. So I think that there's a lot of gender play that is enabled by the Hebrew language itself.
It's so interesting to me to hear about something that I didn't know historically, which is that in Babylonia, women had a more expansive role in society, and that the encounter of Judaism or Israelites with that society would have changed their approach to Judaism so profoundly. And obviously that connects to our time, not only to, let's say, Western feminism, but also today to what's going on. And maybe this goes to the Godex part of the title in terms of the recognition of the gender spectrum, the fact that there just seems to be an increasing comfort of people to understand their sexual orientation as queer or their gender identity as trans, which has also expanded its meaning. And so it seems natural that in a world like that, Judaism would have to either be changed by that world or die. And that must have also been what they were experiencing in Babylonia. So I'm wondering how you think about and what you're seeing in the world of how people are thinking about God today in light of the changes that we've seen over the last generations in terms of feminism and in light of the changes that we're seeing in our time in terms of sexual orientation and gender.
One of my favorite passages, again, from this second Isaiah, is the prophet is describing how hard God is working to bring the people back to the land of Israel. And the prophet uses the imagery of a warrior. And for one or two verses, the prophet is saying God is like a warrior fighting with all his might. And there's this very kind of like masculine imagery. And then the very next verse says, and also like a woman giving birth who is like breathing in and out. So in one text, he's saying God is fighting really, really hard. And what is this like? And uses examples of what we associate, or certainly what they did in that time, of male and female together at once. The impact of Babylonia, I think, is really significant. A lot of studies in the past 10 years have shown a lot more of what life was like for the Jews in Babylonia. And it seems that they were pretty integrated into the larger life. And in Babylonia, there were priestesses, and they were very, very well respected. These priestesses did not get pregnant. If they wanted an heir, they would turn to one of the lower ranking priestesses to have a child for them. And a scholar by the name of Savina Tubal, I think this is back in the 90s, suggested that Sarah, who never has children, it's not because she's barren and can't have children, but perhaps she represented something of this priestess class who were forbidden from having children. And Hagar may have been also a priestess of a lower rank, having a child for Sarah. I think that there have to have been influences. Women were also more independent economically. And this is one of the things that Ezekiel seems to rant against, that the women have financial autonomy and are making decisions about things. And then that kind of leads to the sense that the women are emasculating men.
So I have another question that is not just about the Bible itself, but about, the why of studying it. I mean, the question kind of boils down to like, why is it a deep value for people of whatever theologies, of whatever background, to engage in this learning? And I think part of the way that we organizationally would answer that is that our presumption about the Jewish time that we're in, and it's not just true of this time, it's been true of other times, but we're in a time of massive change and transition in what we call Judaism and what it means and what it looks like and what it is. And that's exciting and awesome. And it means that we have this incredible opportunity to mine all the gems of Jewish tradition from all sorts of different areas and sort of remix them into new forms today. A big old jazz improv session that we're like going around, and eventually some of it will solidify into like new compositions. So like that's my argument for why it is so important to mine the depths of Bible for different theological messages, for different ideas of God. Part of what I feel called to say is like, I actually don't totally care if the biblical authors intended everything that I get from it. So like one classic example, the first chapter of Genesis, like right at the beginning, it says a famous verse that has been used in very, very cool ways. Male and female, God created them. And it's not just recently, by the way, even rabbinic or early rabbis noticed that this verse could be read as suggesting that the first human was actually created both male and female simultaneously. And that's a deeply empowering thing when people are trying to find biblical anchors around gender fluidity and being non-binary. To be able to say, not just in the Bible, but in the first chapter, we have a verse that can be read this way. And I believe that it's not just about the intentions of authors. We have agency to notice the textual reality that's there and sort of enliven it with our own contemporary goals. And so not only do I think it's okay to read that text as an anchor of gender fluidity, I think Dafka specifically, we must. Like, it is deeply important to do that. That's part of my why. Again, what's your why for like the purposes of learning about different visions of God in the Hebrew Bible?
Part of it, I think, is helpful as a healing process, and another for the ability to get access to different kinds of resources. So I'll tell you that passage from Genesis about he created man, male and female. I actually do think that the first human being was both male and female. And again, I'm influenced by the environment of the ancient world, in which in Mesopotamia, the goddess Ishtar embodied both male and female. And there are creation stories in which the gods begin to make people, and they're kind of experimenting with different things. And one of the beings that they create is actually a being who is both male and female. Having said that, I agree with you that whether that was intended or not should be completely irrelevant to us and has always been irrelevant, right? When the rabbis are trying to prove a point, they'll take one verse from one place, another verse from another place. It has nothing to do with the context, its original context, right? So we all do this all the time. But I think something like this course helps to break down that inner voice that many people still have about there is a right way to be Jewish. There is a Jewish way of thinking by raising up a variety of really, really different theologies that are in the Bible. I mean, some that just cannot sit side by side, and it's a miracle that they are there side by side. It helps us, I think, internally really get that what we're doing is not transgressive, but rather Jewish, and that it has always been this way. So that, I think, is like part of the healing process. The other piece is that there are just so many gems in the Bible that have not been considered part of the canon within a canon, right? There are many, many different texts that have not been held up as central, either because it's not part of the Torah reading cycle, the texts don't come up in any holidays. But there's some really great material with just fascinating ideas about God. For example, there is a debate within the biblical texts about whether God actually lives in the temple or whether God is only in the heavens. These were two schools that sat side by side with radically different ideas, but they were both pre-Jewish, right? They were both really considered legitimate, and whoever finally, edited this anthology that we call the Hebrew Bible felt that these were all kind of legitimate arguments. So I think that there are great texts to be explored, and as you were saying, mined for gems that may offer us new ways of thinking and that may also support some of our current thinking. This course is not just about studying biblical texts. This course is really about shattering the norms for how we read biblical texts. We will read the biblical texts actually looking for the variety and the differences of opinions and ideologies rather than trying to mesh everything together into one consistent whole. And this is something that I think the kind of academic, historical, critical approach to biblical studies can actually engage Jews in new and, frankly, delightful ways.
Thank you so much, Tamar Kamionkowski, for joining us. We are so grateful to have had this conversation and to have you teaching in the Onion Yeshiva.
Thank you so much.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, the big reminder of this episode, JudaismUnbound.com/classes. That's the link. That's the place. That's the portal to open up Tamar Kamionkowski's amazing course that you can sign up for because you listened to this episode and you were like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I need more. That's the place. JudaismUnbound.com/classes. Go there. Do not pass go. I don't even know where go is because we're not playing Monopoly and that doesn't make any sense. But don't pass it. Go to JudaismUnbound.com/classes instead. That's the spot. We hope that you will register for this course. And also, as we close this episode, we are always really grateful to have your questions, your thoughts, your ideas. If they're related to this course specifically, that's super great. If they're just about Judaism Unbound more generally, feel free to send those our way as well. Here are all the ways that you can be in touch with us. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find the show notes for this episode with related links and all sorts of ways to learn more, in addition to the big button to sign up for her course. Again, we really want you to do that. And third, there's our email addresses, dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We really appreciate when you reach out to us there. And the very last thing that we'd say is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.